Alright, it's been a bit since I've done a video on the channel, and not much has happened in terms of electoral politics within Germany, but there has been a lot of protests and demonstrations over the past several weeks and months over a number of various issues that have led to the current situation we are now in. Now, Germany has not had elections since major elections, that is state or federal elections, since October of 2023, and the next important elections will be in June of this year, and that will be the European parliamentary elections, followed by 3 East German state elections in September. Now, what is happening right now in Germany is there are two main protest movements. There is the farmers' protest, which joined in a few weeks ago off of a protest against the ending of diesel subsidies for the farmers by the current federal government. A lot of that was a push by the Greens, who control the agriculture ministry, to reduce the emissions and the overall production of the farmers as part of their green policies. And this has pushed a lot of backlash from not just the right, but also mainstream in the middle of German society. The AfD has joined along in protest against the government. A lot of their members are there in the protests. And there's also a second protest, which is actually against the AfD. A lot of left wing, center left, or liberal parties have rallied together and started major protests against the AfD's immigration or migration policy, because it came out a few weeks ago that the AfD was planning on deportations. They were reworking their overall migration policy, some of the leadership at a party conference, and as a response to that, the left-wing liberal parties such as the Greens and SPD called on nationwide protest against the AfD. So that is what we see. We see this anger from the public against the federal government. A lot of this anger is going towards support of the AfD, and a lot of the more liberal left-wing elements of German society are in turn also reacting negatively towards the rise of the AfD, which they see as a too polarizing and controversial party for German politics, which for a long while has been very liberal and moderate. Now, if we look at the polls for the European parliamentary elections in June, we see the situation is somewhat similar to the federal election. Now, the European Parliament decides laws for the European Union. It is the legislative body for the EU, and its seats are composed of seats from each member state, Germany being the biggest, and they are divided amongst population, meaning Germany has the most, followed by France and Italy, and then the others. And they are elected on proportional representation, which means that every country in the EU will go to vote to elect members from their national parties, and the national parties are part of larger groups that sit together in Brussels in the European Parliament to decide law. Now, the actual power of the European Parliament is not necessarily as strong as some of the national parliaments, but it is a very important symbolic election. It is an electoral test because, one, it is nationwide. This means every state, every party will be competing, and so this is going to be a very accurate test of what the political situation in Germany is, even more accurate than the polls we have. And as we look at the situation now, the opposition CDU-CSU, the party of Angela Merkel, one of Germany's main parties, is clearly in the head at 28%, with the AfD at 23%. Now, the CDU is roughly at where they were last time. This is not much of a change, but they are clearly in first place as they are in national polling. The AfD at 23% has solidified their position as the second largest party. Now, the AfD first entered into the European Parliament in the elections in 2014, and the AfD was actually a party focused on the Euro, and the European Union was one of their major platforms in reforming and restricting the power of the EU. So this is one of their very important places for them to do well in. This is one of the original places they were first represented in actual mandates for Germany. And we see the Greens and the other left-wing parties are down here in third, fourth. The Bundesrepublik, the new alliance which split away from Die Linke, is polling above 5%. The polling on this party is very inconsistent. Some polls don't even have the party. And its organization is not yet clearly defined. They are running in this election, and of course the European Parliament elections for Germany does not have the 5% threshold, so 7% they will definitely get seats. Even Die Linke, which sits here at 3%, will likely get a few seats if they hold that percentage, but clearly we can see that Die Linke has suffered heavy losses. They are no longer a major party in German politics, and they have somewhat been replaced by the Bundesrepublik if this trend continues. The SPD, the party of Germany's Chancellor Olaf Scholz, only at 9%. This is a terrible result, putting them at fourth place, below 10%. This has never happened for the SPD, And for them to be at fourth place while the Greens, as a left wing party, are only at 13% is a very bad development for them. Now, what we can see from this is the trends of the federal politics into national polling is pretty much reflected here. There's not too many differences. This election will be held in June and it will be a big deal. Now, the other elections we have are in 3 East German states, the first of which is Brandenburg. Brandenburg is a traditional left wing state ruled by the SPD since 1990. This state is one of the 3 that make up one of the 5 East German states, including or excluding rather, Berlin, which is a mixed state of East and West, and Brandenburg, Saxony, and Thuringia are all voting. In all 5 of these states, the AfD is pretty much polling far ahead. Saxony-Anhalt is the only one where it's pretty much close between the AfD and the CDU. But as we can see, the last poll here, AfD is at 28%, which is a 10-point lead over the CDU, an 11-point lead over the SPD, and there was no clear second place party to take on the AfD. Even though the AfD is not the incumbent, they are clearly far ahead. Initially, there were thoughts that the Alliance Wagenknecht, the BSV or BSW, would manage to pull away support. And it appears they have pulled away some support from the AfD. But if you look at some of the recent polls, they saw a drop in their initial support and are not taking as much away from the AfD as allowing the party to remain in first place. But the polling does differentiate based on the results of the Bundeswagenknecht. But regardless, the AfD is still ahead. If we look at the aggregate, it's the same thing. Now, this is going to be an important state because if the AfD can come to power in any of these states, it sets a huge precedent for the party. It is a huge breakthrough, and this is one of the 3 shots. Now, this is a very traditional left-wing state, but we can see the AfD and the CDU together are polling at a majority. Now, it's unlikely for the 2 parties to work together, but still that is an interesting development and will make it very hard for a government to be formed at the state level. The current government is just below a majority. That is a mixed government of center-left and center-right parties, but we will see what happens. If you look at Thuringia, this is the most interesting state. This is a state where the incumbent governor is from Die Linke Ramelow, and we see the party is pretty much split, the left rather, between Die Linke and the Bundeswagenknecht around 15% each. There are some polls that have them very low. It's not very clear yet how much they're going to get. I think a lot of the polls are not necessarily asking voters about her party, and I think that a lot of people have not realized, come to terms with their party being on the scene yet. I think it took them a while to actually found it as an official party. It was just an organization at first, and so we will have to see what happens with them. But the CDU is steady at around 20% in the latest polls. But even then, the AfD, regardless of how strong these other parties are, is in first place. Somewhere between 30 and 35%. If we look at the aggregate, they're around 33%, clearly ahead. And here again, we have the AfD and the CDU, both right-wing parties, polling well above a majority. The government of the incumbent governor has basically no chance in returning to power, because the divisions between the 2 left-wing, the Splinter Party, is going to be very high, and it's very unlikely that they're going to easily work together without any conflict. I think the most likely scenario here is actually maybe new elections, a minority government from between the CDU and Die Linke is possible, but then again, the CDU will be not too happy with that. There could be more conservative elements that defect and even join the AfD or sit as a different opposition group, a different faction maybe. Or sit as independents. So this is a state that's very important because of the pressure put on by the left-wing parties. There's really not a feasible coalition here. That's nothing that's viable. And so there's really no one knows what's going to happen. This is probably the most important election out of all 4, even though it's a small state, because it's unpredictable and undecided. And if the AfD is able to win here by using that leverage, that will set a huge precedent, and then they will be able to come into power in other states. The last state is Saxony. Now, Saxony is actually the best state for the AfD and the CDU. It is the most right-wing state of all 3, mathematically speaking and historically speaking. However, the CDU is so strong here that the AfD is in the weakest position to gain the governorship, and the CDU is in a strong position to retain it, despite the fact that the AfD has probably the best numbers here. And this is because the CDU is just so strong. The left-wing parties over the past 4 or 5 years have voted for the CDU in order to prevent the AfD from winning consistently in this state. And we see, Die Linke, this is, East Germany still. This is their heartland. Falling potentially below 5% in the state would be huge. We see all the left-wing parties that are viable at this state around 8%, 8%. And if we look at the aggregate, we see that the left-wing parties together don't even make up, the same position or the same portion of the parliament as one of the right-wing parties alone. So this is going to be a race between the AFD and the CDU. And if the CDU comes second place, but they're able to maintain a majority with the Greens and the SPD, then they will retain in government, and the current governor, Michael Kretschmer, will be reelected. So the main elections are going to be Thuringia and the EU election. The EU election will be a test to see if the polls we've had over the past several months are actually true, and if they can actually be solidified into actual electoral results. And Thuringia is the most dynamic and politically interesting state where something can happen potentially for the AFD to get into power. So this is going to be a huge battleground. There'll be a huge focus on these states in September. So as more polls come out, of course, I will do more videos on these elections, which will be a big deal. But I just wanted to give a quick update on these elections and where it stands now. And so I hope you all enjoyed this video. Please like, share, and subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.